Welcome back. You'll have noticed that our first two figures, Hatshepsut and Cleopatra, were both the subjects of posthumous attempts to erase their memory, each at the hands of men. Hypatia, however, was denied even the chance to live out her life before such efforts began. She was killed by those who tried to silence her. But in trying to erase her, they instead ensured her name and her legacy would last for millennia. Hypatia was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, a mathematician and scholar. Theon was the head or director, kind of headmaster and administrator as well as lecturer of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, known as the Museon, from where we get the word museum. The school, I'll call it that because Museon feels a bit pretentious, was a key center of philosophical thought from the 3rd to the 7th centuries CE, blending Platonism with Stoicism, Aristotelianism, science and religious ideas from Judaism, Christianity, and Eastern traditions. The school influenced early Christian theology, promoting allegorical Bible interpretation rather than a strict literal interpretation. It wasn't a formal university with a dedicated campus or buildings like modern institutions. It was more of an intellectual circle or private academy, centered around master teachers and their students. Teaching occurred in homes, lecture halls rented for sessions, or public spaces rather than fixed school structures. As its head, it's likely that Theon was the one who trained Hypatia in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and rhetoric. In the Greco-Roman world, girls could sometimes receive instruction at home, especially if a father was unusually committed to education, but the kind of advanced training Hypatia received in these subjects was exceptional for a woman. For most women, education was narrower and more domestic in scope. Hypatia's was clearly aimed at producing a scholar, not just an educated daughter. And Theon seems to have treated her as a serious intellectual collaborator. One source notes that he supervised her studies with the aim of making her a, quote, perfect human being. This placed her in a very rare category, a woman trained in the same high-level scholarly culture that educated elite men entered, a woman far more educated than most men. Hypatia seems to have been an extraordinary pupil and someone who put a rare, naturally gifted mind to work on subjects that very few women ever touched. The evidence points to a combination of privileged education and exceptional talent. Late antique and early medieval writers describe Hypatia as far surpassing other philosophers of her time, not just in learning, but in the clarity and force of her teaching. Synesius, one of her students and later a bishop, wrote letters praising her as a brilliant teacher and implying that he regarded her as his intellectual superior. He also credited her with inventing or refining instruments such as the type of astrolabe and devices for measuring water density. Later biographical studies mentioned that she authored commentaries on Diophantus' Arithmetica and Apollonius's Conics, works that required a deep grasp of advanced algebra and geometry, and that she added original problems and solutions, suggesting genuine creative engagement rather than mere repetition of her father's work. That Hypatia eventually succeeded her father to become head of the school in Alexandria and was widely regarded as the city's leading intellectual figure by her 30s suggests that she not only mastered what was taught to her, but pushed beyond it. We don't know a lot about Hypatia, but what seems clear is that she was the product of a uniquely good education combined with a rare aptitude for technical and philosophical thought. Her innovations in algebra, her improvement of instruments, and the way later sources treat her as surpassing her contemporaries all point to a natural brilliance that her father's training then amplified. She was a gifted mind who also happened to be one of the very few women in the ancient world to receive the kind of schooling that would let that talent fully express itself. She taught in the school in Alexandria, lecturing on philosophy, especially Plotinus's Neoplatonism, mathematics and astronomy, and she became head of the school around 400 CE. She was famous not only as a scholar but also as a civic advisor and public teacher, drawing students and admirers from across the Mediterranean. She advised Orestes, the Roman prefect or governor of Alexandria, and was known for her wisdom and moral authority in a city riven by religious and political tensions between Christians, pagans, and Jews. And it was these political tensions that were to be her downfall. Alexandria in Theon's time was no longer the relatively stable, cosmopolitan centre of learning that it had once been. The city was being reshaped by political unrest, religious conflict, and the gradual weakening of the old scholarly institutions of learning by centuries of political instability, reduced patronage, war, and administrative neglect. So scholarship survived less as a thriving public institution than as a fragile inheritance that had to be actively maintained. Theon's role was essentially preservative. He's associated with edited and commented versions of major scientific texts, especially Ptolemy's Almagest and Euclid's Elements, and one source shows that Hypatia later revised his commentary on the Almagest, showing that father and daughter worked in a shared scholarly project of transmitting difficult texts in usable form. In other words, Theon appears to have been trying to save the mathematical tradition by making it accurate, accessible, and teachable at a time when much of the older intellectual infrastructure was collapsing. And Hypatia continued that work, but she seems to have pushed it further. The commentaries on the Arithmetica and Conics suggest that she was not only preserving inherited knowledge, but also helping students and readers move into more advanced and specialized areas of mathematics. She also taught philosophy publicly, turning scholarship into a living practice rather than just a sealed archive. So we might say that scholarship at the time was fragile. So the idea is that it was exposed to both material loss and cultural hostility. The old institutions that had sustained Greek learning were declining. Books and expertise were harder to preserve. And Christian pagan political tensions made philosophical and scientific work newly dangerous. Theon responded by editing, revising, and safeguarding foundational texts. Hypatia inherited that mission and carried it forward through teaching, commentary, and the training of new students. But Alexandria was increasingly shaped by religious conflict. The growth of Christianity and the decline of traditional pagan civic culture created intense tensions between communities, and those tensions could easily spill into violence, especially around temples, statues, and symbols of older learning and worship. In that environment, a philosopher-mathematician like Hypatia, who was associated with classical humanities and with elite pagan intellectual culture, could easily become entangled in struggles that were as political as they were religious. Enter Cyril of Alexandria, a prominent Christian theologian and patriarch of Alexandria from 412 CE, renowned for his, shall we say, staunch defense of orthodoxy. Hypatia became a hate figure for Christian zealots allied with Cyril because of her political associations, her religious identity, and just for what she symbolized. She was a prominent pagan-leaning philosopher and close advisor to Orestes, the Roman prefect, at a time when Cyril was trying to consolidate ecclesiastical power and push Alexandria towards a more hardline Christian order. As the conflict between Orestes and Cyril intensified over issues like violence between Christian and Jewish communities, the regulation of public processions, and generally the balance of power in the city, Cyril's supporters began to blame Hypatia for Orestes' resistance. Rumours spread that she was using her influence to turn Orestes against the bishop, and some even accused her of practicing magic or astrology, language that turned a political dispute into a moral and religious one. To Cyril's more radical followers, Hypatia embodied both the stubborn survival of pagan philosophy and the persistence of elite secular power. Eliminating her became a way of striking at both Orestes and the intellectual tradition he represented. So there was no formal doctrinal debate between Hypatia and Cyril. Their conflict was political and symbolic. Cyril wanted to centralize Christian authority in Alexandria and marginalize traditional pagan elites. Hypatia stood at the center of a network, Orestes, Synesius, and other aristocratic patrons, that resisted that takeover. In practice, the dispute was less a personal quarrel than the collision of two worlds: a powerful bishop pushing a militant Christian agenda against a female philosopher who embodied the old cosmopolitan Alexandrian intellectual tradition. After failing to break Orestes' political resistance directly, Cyril's more radical followers turned on Hypatia, portraying her as the lion in the path to reconciliation and using her as a proxy attack on the prefect's authority. Her fate was less about doctrine and more about power, about image, and the attempt to erase a symbol of a rival intellectual order. In March 415 CE, Hypatia was ambushed while traveling through Alexandria in her chariot, probably returning home from teaching or public duties, as she often appeared publicly. She wasn't alone, she had attendants typical for her status, but they could offer little protection against the mob that dragged her from her chariot, stripped her naked, and took her to the Caesareum church, where they flayed her and dismembered her body before dragging the remains through the streets and then burning them in the temple district of Alexandria. Such a brutal and public murder, mutilating and burning her body, was an act of ritualized condemnation. Accounts suggest that Cyril's inner circle encouraged, or at least tolerated, the violence, presenting Hypatia as the obstacle to peace and reconciliation between the bishop and the prefect. In one stroke, the murder aimed to silence a powerful critic, terrify other intellectuals into silence, and assert the dominance of the church. And it did all those things. It was successful to that extent. But the murder sent shockwaves through the Eastern Roman Empire. Philosophers, especially in Alexandria, had long been treated as a protected class of public intellectuals. So the mob murder of a female philosopher was seen as profoundly destabilizing. The Alexandrian council sent an embassy to the court in Constantinople to protest what they viewed as a dangerous overreach by Cyril, which led the emperors Honorius and Theodosius II to issue an edict in 416 that reined in Cyril's militia, limiting their number and activities, effectively punishing him indirectly. Limiting his militia was a clear rebuke aimed at checking his use of violence, but it stopped far short of removing him from office or punishing him in a real way for his role in the murder. In fact, no one was ever punished for the murder. Cyril remained Patriarch of Alexandria until his death in 444, and he was eventually canonized in both the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic traditions, meaning that while his authority was temporarily constrained and his image tarnished, there were no significant consequences for what happened to Hypatia. Hypatia's murder marked the turning point in Cyril's struggle for control of the city. Hypatia had been the intellectual linchpin of Orestes' opposition. Once she was removed, that resistance quickly collapsed and Orestes soon vanished from the sources, probably either recalled or forced out of office. With Hypatia's influence erased, Cyril consolidated both religious and de facto political authority in Alexandria, significantly strengthening the bishop's power relative to the secular prefect. Beyond this, Hypatia's death is often seen as the symbolic endpoint for Alexandria's role as the last great centre of Hellenic philosophical learning. After her murder, the tradition of public philosophical teaching in the city rapidly declined. Many philosophers left or worked in obscurity, and the Alexandrian school effectively closed. Because of this, later writers and modern scholars have framed her killing as much more than a personal tragedy. It became a turning point image of the loss of classical intellectual freedom, the moment when religious violence began to override the old civic philosophical idea of reasoned public discourse. That symbolism is interesting, and I'd like to dig into it a bit more before wrapping up. Hypatia's legacy lies first in what she represented in her own lifetime, a rare, commanding public intellectual who taught mathematics, astronomy and philosophy in late antique Alexandria, and who helped preserve the Greek mathematical tradition through her commentaries. She was a celebrated lecturer whose students came from well beyond Alexandria, which meant her impact spread through people as much as through texts. In a world where elite philosophical education was overwhelmingly male, Hypatia's authority itself became part of her legacy. She demonstrated that women could occupy the highest intellectual ranks in the Greco-Roman world. But just as important is the symbolic force her life acquired after her death. Her brutal murder made her a powerful feminist symbol and a figure of affirmation for intellectual endeavour in the face of prejudice. Later history shows that writers and artists repeatedly recast her as a sign of lost classical learning, religious conflict, or of women's intellectual possibility. That means Hypatia's influence extends beyond the content of her surviving scholarship. She's become a historical touchstone through which later generations have argued about reason, about faith, and about gender. Her legacy also shaped the modern imagination of women in science. She's an early example of how women's intellectual work was often made possible only through unusual family support, and then later overlooked or diminished. In that sense, Hypatia stands not only as an individual exceptional figure, but as a model for studying the structural barriers that limited women's participation in knowledge making for centuries. And finally, Hypatia's influence endures because she sits at the intersection of scholarship and myth. Her historical writings were lost, but her name survived because later generations kept returning to her as a symbol of disciplined thought, philosophical independence, and resistance to violence. This is why she remains so powerful today. She's remembered both as a real mathematician and philosopher, but also as a lasting emblem of the vulnerability and endurance of learning itself. Hypatia's legacy is less that of a well-documented three-dimensional human being and more that of a powerful symbol. Her sparse biographical record has made her unusually easy to project onto, and later generations have repeatedly reshaped her into the image they needed. What we actually know about her life is limited and partly filtered through later myth-making, so her real personality and beliefs are often blurred by what people want her to represent. Reason, feminism, paganism, enlightened science, even martyrdom. Over time, different movements have used Hypatia for different ends. In late antiquity, Neoplatonists treated her as a martyr for philosophy, letting her death fuel growing hostility towards Christian bishops and a sharpened sense of pagan intellectual identity. In the Middle Ages, she was quietly co-opted into Christian devotional culture, while Enlightenment writers like Voltaire and John Toland turned her into a weapon against the church, arguing that her killing proved both the oppressiveness of Catholicism and the intellectual equality of women. In the 19th and 20th centuries, she became a feminist icon and the last of the Hellenes, a romantic figure, symbolizing the noble death of classical learning under religious fanaticism. Because sources on her life are fragmentary and her work is now lost, later creators, historians, novelists, filmmakers, activists have had wide latitude to refashion her. For instance, Charles Kingsley's 19th century novel Hypatia and the 2009 film Agora present her as a proto-modern scientist battling obscurantist Christianity, a narrative that simplifies the original politics and religious tensions. Today's universities, women in STEM projects, and feminist movements often name awards, journals, or conferences after her, using her image to signal a commitment to intellectual freedom, gender equality, and resistance to dogma. Hypatia is often used as a symbolic ancestor, and many institutions and prizes bear her name. Her legacy is visible in things like journals, science prizes, trusts, and networks that explicitly invoke her to celebrate women's thought, science, and resistance to silencing. In that sense, her most enduring legacy is that her story has become a kind of mirror. Depending on who's telling it, Hypatia can stand for the martyrdom of reason, the triumph of female intellect, or the danger of mixing religious authority with political violence. The men who tried to silence her amplified her influence beyond all imaginings. No one will ever remember Cyril in the same way. Whichever story you choose to tell, she was clearly an extraordinary woman whose life and work was cut short, but who remains an inspiration. Next time, we'll move slightly further east and another 300 years or so forward in history and look at the life and work of Aisha bint Abi Bakr al-Siddiqa, the third wife of the Prophet Muhammad, a leading scholar who transmitted thousands of hadiths and played a key role in early Islamic politics. But for now, thank you very much for joining me. Please feed the algorithm by clicking like, share, and subscribe on your way out. And remember, whatever you're up to, have a great day.